and welcome to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is chapter 6, The Remarkable Incident of Lanyon. So just have a quick recap from the end of chapter 5. We left it with Mr. Utterson being put in quite a difficult position once again. He has tried to help and support his friend Dr. Jekyll. The murder of Danvers Carew then arose, which puts Jekyll's reputation into jeopardy once again. He gave Utterson a particular reassurance, if you recall, that he would not see Mr. Hyde ever again, that this was the final time that he'd seen him and that he was rid of him completely. However, the chapter ended with Mr. Utterson taking a letter that was supposedly written by Mr. Hyde to Dr. Jekyll, reassuring him of his disappearance. He gave it to his one of his employees, his chief clerk, a man called Mr. Guest, who is an expert in handwriting in what we call graphology. And he studied the handwriting and concluded that the writer wasn't mad, but there was something odd about it. At the same moment, if you recall, one of Utterson's servants came in bearing a letter from Dr. Jekyll, which was inviting him to dinner at some point in the next few days. And when Guest saw the letter, he asked if he could look at the two of them together. So he put the letter supposedly from Mr. Hyde and the letter from Dr. Jekyll side by side, and noted that this was the same person writing both, but sloping their handwritings in opposite direction. And it led Utterson at the end of the chapter to become quite concerned once again for Henry Jekyll, not necessarily because of him perhaps being blackmailed by Mr. Hyde, although that is of course still a consideration, but perhaps that he's involved in events, quite dark and unpleasant events, much more so than Utterson would want him to be involved in. Most notably in this case, it's of course the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, the very, very unprovoked and very violent attack. So we come into this chapter now, Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Now, as we've seen before, every chapter title has significance in some respect. And this here, the fact that it's called the Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon, suggests that there is something quite unusual, quite out of the ordinary, because it's remarkable. And if it's an incident, it suggests that it's a particular event that's happened, and it draws our attention to a character that we've seen previously. If you recall, we met Dr. Lanyon, I think it was in chapter 2, where Utterson went to visit him to talk to him about Dr. Jekyll, about his views of him, and also whether or not he had met Mr. Hyde, the protege of Dr. Jekyll, apparently. And if you recall back in that chapter, in chapter 3, Dr. Lanyon said that he had no real contact with Dr. Jekyll for about 10 years. The fact that they differed on something scientific, and Utterson came away from the conversation, if you remember, fairly reassured that it was just perhaps a professional debate that had occurred between the two men, between Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll, that had led them to fall out. If you remember, when Lanyon is questioned about Jekyll, he refers to his dealings as unscientific balderdash, in other words, rubbish, unscientific rubbish. Whereas in the following chapter, where I think it was chapter, is it later in that chapter? Yeah, later in that chapter, when Utterson talks to Dr. Jekyll, he talks about Lanyon and says that he's a pedant, which suggests that he is very precise and very pedantic and perhaps quite old-fashioned and traditional in his ways. So that was the last time that we've seen Dr. Lanyon. So although he only occurs in the novel, perhaps, and we meet him 3 times, with this being the second time that we actually meet him. The final time that we come across Dr. Lanyon is actually in chapter 9, where he's given an entire chapter to himself, and he becomes the narrator. So he is a fairly significant character, because he's someone that hasn't seen Dr. Jekyll for some time, so he's able to see the differences. He's also a man in the same profession as Dr. Jekyll, which puts the two of them on fairly equal footing. And later on, we see that it's a reason why Dr. Jekyll turns to Dr. Lanyon for help and support at a point that he desperately needs it, right? So here we have a return to this character once again of Dr. Lanyon. Notice in this chapter the way that Stevenson, as the third-person narrator, starts talking about very specific dates. Now, when we when he does this, it's suggesting to us as the reader that these are important dates, that they've almost been noted down by somebody, or perhaps they've been used maybe in some kind of witness evidence or in some kind of police statement. So that the whole thing has got an air of quite seriousness about it, because it suggests that these particular dates and times where it discusses Lanyon and Jekyll are quite significant in some way. So look out for that as we move into the chapter. It's another fairly short chapter. It's only just under 3 sides long. So we can see that the story is moving quite quickly now up towards some of the main events of the novel. So, remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Time ran on. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward, for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as a public injury. But Mr. Hyde had disappeared out of the ken of the police, as though he had never existed. So it seems that the murder of Danvers Carew created quite a stir, because he was quite an important senior figure, and the fact there's been an awful lot of money that's been offered in reward would mean that people would be really compelled to try and hunt for this man in order to get the reward, to try and find the murderer. But it seems that he's, as it says here, he's disappeared out of the ken. The ken just means the knowledge or the understanding. So he seems to have disappeared completely out of range as far as the police are concerned, as though he'd never existed. Much of his past was unearthed indeed, and all disreputable. Disreputable means bad, immoral, or sinful. Tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career. But of his present whereabouts, not a whisper. So it seems that as they're trying to search for Mr. Hyde, they've been looking into his past and finding out that every link that they can find to do with Mr. Hyde is negative, is bad. Now, we don't know whether that's true, or whether this is just people kind of making up stories because they know that he's a murderer. Because of course he's only existed as a person in his own right for a relatively short amount of time. From the time he'd left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out. And gradually, as time drew on, Mr. Utterson began to recover from the hotness of his alarm, and to grow more quiet with himself. So it seems that as time's passed, Mr. Hyde has literally just disappeared. He's been blotted out, as though he never existed. And it seems as though Utterson's starting to calm a little. His fears are being calmed, not because there's a resolution to anything, but because there's nothing else that's happening. There's nothing else that's coming of the events. The death of Sir Danvers was, his way of thinking, more than paid for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde. Now that evil influence had been withdrawn, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion, renewed relations with his friends, became once more their familiar guest and entertainer. And whilst he had always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for religion. He was busy, he was much in the open air, he did good. His face seemed to open and brighten, as if with an inward conscience of service, and for more than 2 months the doctor was at peace. So Stevenson is showing here that with the disappearance of Edward Hyde, there is a significant change in Dr. Jekyll, and he goes back to being the man that he was before. The fact that he renewed relations with his friends suggests that perhaps where he sort of stopped having contact with his friends, he's got back into them. He came out of his seclusion, and all of this we find out later on is because when obviously he was Edward Hyde, he couldn't be around people, certainly people that knew him as Dr. Jekyll, and it suggests that now he's had to kind of put Mr. Hyde away. He can't turn into him anymore, because if Hyde were to be discovered, he would be executed, which would be the death of obviously both of them, because they're the same person. So it seems that with Hyde out of the way, he transforms back to his old self. And it talks about that whilst he'd always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for religion, which suggests that he becomes incredibly charitable and actually a very religious man. Now, knowing what we know about him and the fact that he was responsible for the murder of Danvers Carew, this is perhaps his way of making amends. Obviously, he can't tell anybody what he's done. So this is his way of kind of compensating for what he's done. So he's improving his work with charity, and he's turning very much to God and religion. So this happens for 2 months, and it talks about this inward consciousness of service. For 2 months, the doctor was at peace. And the fact that Stevenson here at the end of the paragraph notes the term of 2 months suggests that something is about to change, that after the 2 months is over, there is a distinct change in his behaviour once again. notice how in this next paragraph we have a series of several dates. On the 8th of January, Utterson had dined at the doctor's with a small party. Lanyon had been there, and the face of the host had looked from one to the other as in the old days when the trio were inseparable friends. So the first thing to note in this paragraph then is that it seems that Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll have renewed their friendship, which suggests that whatever it is that they differed on in terms of their scientific knowledge or experimentation has been put aside, and the two of them have become friends again after these 10 years. On the 12th and again on the 14th, the door was shut against the lawyer. The doctor was confined to the house, Paul said, and saw no one. On the 15th, he tried again and was again refused. And having now been used for the last 2 months to see his friend almost daily, he found this return of solitude to weigh upon his spirits. The 5th night he had him guest to dine with him, and the 6th he betook himself to Dr. Lanyon's. So it seems that after 2 months of this renewed friendship and the fact that Utterson had become a very familiar visitor once again at Dr. Jekyll's, they have a dinner party on the 8th, and then on the 12th, and then on the 14th, so 4 and 6 days later, Utterson is told that the doctor is confined to the house, so he's not receiving visitors. And Utterson's obviously quite confused about this because he's had 2 months of being a very regular visitor, and now suddenly he's been refused. So he's quite confused about this. So where does he go? He turns to Dr. Lanyon. There, at least, he was not denied admittance. But when he came in, he was shocked at the change which had taken place in the doctor's appearance. Now, the doctor he was talking about, of course, is Dr. Lanyon. So if you recall, the first time that we met Dr. Lanyon, he was described as being a very big, larger-than-life, very jovial, red-faced gentleman. Look at the description that Stevenson uses here. It's very, very significantly changed. He had his death warrant written legibly upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale. His flesh had fallen away. He was visibly balder and older. And yet it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice, as a look in the eye and quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. It was unlikely that the doctor should fear death, and yet that was what Utterson was tempted to suspect. Yes, he thought, he's a doctor, he must know his own state and that his days are counted, and the knowledge is more than he can bear. And yet when Utterson remarked on his ill looks, it was with an air of great firmness that Lanyon declared himself a doomed man. So it seems that in the week, so between the 8th of January, where they will dine together, and the 15th, where he goes around to Lanyon's, something significant has happened to Lanyon. In that week, he's lost weight, he's grown very pale, his flesh has fallen away, and most significantly, it's not just the physical changes that Mr. Utterson notes, but it's something more, much more deep-seated, much more psychological, when it talks about the deep-seated terror of the mind. I've had a shock, he said, and I shall never recover. It is a question of weeks. Well, life has been pleasant. I liked it, yes, sir. I used to like it. I sometimes think if we knew all, we should be more glad to get away. Jekyll is ill too, observed Utterson. Have you seen him? But Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand. I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll, he said in a loud, unsteady voice. I am quite done with that person, and I beg that you will spare me any allusion to one whom I regard as dead. So it seems then that Lanyon is fully aware of the fact that he's a dying man. Now, perhaps Utterson maybe at first initially assumes that there's some perhaps illness that he hasn't told his friends about, and that has suddenly changed him, and he realises that his death is imminent. And as he says here, it's a question of weeks. So Lanyon realised that he doesn't have very long to live. Now, we're going obviously back to the late Victorian period when the book was written. People did believe that they could die of shock. Now, we know today that you can't necessarily die of having a terrible shock, but what that would perhaps do would trigger maybe a heart defect or some other sort of illness that you have that's been sort of sitting sort of hidden away within you. Lanyon is utterly convinced that he's going to die, that his time is nearly up. And look at the change that occurs here. So at the top of the page, it talks about the fact that Utterson, Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll dined together. And it says that the trio were inseparable friends. And yet here, as soon as Utterson mentions Dr. Jekyll's name and says that he too is ill, it says that Lanyon's face changed. And he says, I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll. one whom I regard as dead. So according to, as far as Lanyon is concerned, Jekyll is dead to him. And that's obviously a really significant change, especially given that he won't tell Utterson what the problem is. But it seems that perhaps sometime in that week he's received a huge shock that is something to do with Dr. Jekyll. Now, we find out later on in chapter 9, which is the chapter that Lanyon has given over to him to narrate his side of the story, we discover that during that week, Lanyon, by accidental means, becomes the first person ever to witness Mr. Hyde turning into Dr. Jekyll. And it's this that's given him this considerable shock that eventually leads to his death. "Tut, tut," said Mr. Utterson, and then after a considerable pause, "Can't I do anything?" he inquired. "We are three very old friends, Lanyon. We shall not live to make others." "Nothing can be done," returned Lanyon. "Ask himself." "He will not see me," said the lawyer. "I'm not surprised at that," was the reply. "Some day, Utterson, after I am dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this. I cannot tell you. And in the meantime, if you can sit and talk with me of other things, for God's sake, stay and do so. But if you cannot keep clear of this accursed topic, then in God's name go, for I cannot bear it." Now, it's interesting here that Lanyon talks about, when he says about after I'm dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this, because that's exactly what Utterson does, because chapter 9, which is narrated by Lanyon, is actually comes in the form of a letter that Lanyon wrote for Utterson to be opened upon his death, and also the death of or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll. He also says, if you look at the language that Lanyon uses, he talks about God when he says about "for God's sake," which kind of ties him to religion and positivity, which is the opposite, the antithesis of the things that he's witnessed Dr. Jekyll do, but of course he can't talk about it. It's also interesting to note that because Stevenson has them both as doctors, doctors in the medical profession, when they're qualified, they have to undertake something what's called the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is a very, very ancient oath that goes right back to I think it goes back to Greek times. And it's an oath of confidentiality that doctors have to swear when they're brought into the profession. In other words, that they are not allowed to tell people what they've seen and heard as a doctor. Is completely confidential between them and their patients. And that's quite important, because we find out later on that Dr. Jekyll made Lanyon swear under his Hippocratic Oath as a doctor not to reveal the secret that Jekyll shows him in the change between himself and Mr. Hyde. And it's this that is kind of Lanyon's undoing. It's what leads to his death, because he's not able to confide in anybody. So he made the promise, we find out later on, that he made the promise to Jekyll not to tell anybody what he was about to watch, but then what he actually observed in the transformation from Hyde into Jekyll was too much for him to be able to bear. As soon as he got home, Utterson sat down and wrote to Jekyll, complaining of his exclusion from the house and asking the cause of this unhappy break with Lanyon. And the next day brought him a long answer, often very pathetically worded and sometimes darkly mysterious in drift. The quarrel with Lanyon was incurable. "I do not blame our old friend," Jekyll wrote, "but I share his view that we must never meet. I mean from henceforth to lead a life of extreme seclusion. You must not be surprised, nor must you doubt my friendship if my door is often shut even to you. You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought upon myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. I could not think that this earth contained a place for sufferings and terrors so unmanning. You can do but one thing, Utterson, to lighten this destiny, and that is to respect my silence." So the little bit there that I've just read, that paragraph there, comes from a letter that Jekyll wrote to Utterson in response to a letter that Utterson wrote to Jekyll, in which he sort of complained about the fact that Jekyll wasn't seeing him anymore. And basically, Jekyll is saying here that he intends now to lead a life of seclusion, that he probably won't be seeing anybody, and that as much as he's upset about Dr. Lanyon's status, he agrees with Dr. Lanyon that the two of them can never see each other again. And if you look at the language that Jekyll uses in this note here to Utterson, he says things like, "You must suffer me to go my own dark way." Look at the use of negative language there, quite devilish and quite hellish language of the dark way, the idea of reference to sin. He says about, "I brought upon myself a punishment and danger that I cannot name." He says, "If I'm chief of sinners, I'm the chief of sufferers also." Now that's quite interesting, because we've mentioned beforehand that Dr. Jekyll is quite cowardly and quite selfish in his ways, and here he's basically saying that if he's the chief of sinners, so if he's done very, very wrong, and we find out that's because of the experimentation that he's done in transforming between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He also considers himself to be chief of sufferers. So there's something quite cowardly, once again, in his manner, in the sense that he's almost trying to get sympathy from us, because even though he's done terribly wrong, he's trying to imply here that he's chief of sufferers, that he's suffering for what he's done. Utterson was amazed. The dark influence of Hyde had been withdrawn. The doctor had returned to his old tasks and amenities. A week ago, the prospect had smiled with every promise of a cheerful and an honoured age. And now, in a moment, friendship and peace of mind and the whole tenor of his life were wrecked. So great and unprepared a change pointed to madness. But in view of Lanion's manner and words, there must lie for it some deeper ground. So when he receives Dr. Jekyll's letter, which shows a massive change in him and in the friendship that has suddenly renewed itself between Utterson, Jekyll and Lanyon, Utterson believes that perhaps Jekyll has gone mad, but then when he bears in mind the fact that Lanyon has also undergone this huge change and this massive shock, as he says here, there must lie for it some deeper ground. So Utterson once again is drawn into this mystery. He's desperate to find out what it is that has led to the very, very sudden and very unexpected demise or downturn of his two closest friends. A week afterwards, Dr. Lanyon took to his bed, and in something less than a fortnight he was dead. The night after the funeral, at which he had been sadly affected, Utterson locked the door of his business room, and sitting there by the light of a melancholy candle, drew out and set before him an envelope addressed by the hand and sealed with the seal of his dead friend. Private, for the hands of J. G. Utterson alone, and in case of his predecease, to be destroyed unread. So it was emphatically superscribed, and the lawyer dreaded to behold the contents. So we have the very sudden death of Lanyon. It doesn't go into very much detail about it. And then the night after the funeral, Utterson sits in his business room. He opens up his safe and he takes out an envelope. And the envelope is addressed for the hands of Mr. Utterson alone, and in case of his predecease, to be destroyed unread. Predecease means that if Utterson were to die before Lanyon does, then the contents of the envelope to be destroyed, and no one else is to read them. So we can see, I mentioned, I think very early on in chapter 1, about the fact that Utterson's safe is actually quite a significant place, because it holds several letters and several such documents which are sealed and which people have trusted Utterson with, and all of them in some way are little pieces of the jigsaw to solving the mystery. Okay. I've buried one friend today, Utterson thought. What if this should cost me another? And then he condemned the fear as a disloyalty and broke the seal. So breaking the seal means that he opened the seal of the envelope. Back in this time, important documents would be sealed. They didn't have envelopes like we have today, where you'd sort of lick them and seal them. They would have small blocks of wax. They would melt the end of the wax under a candle. They would let the wax drip over the seal of the envelope, and then they would usually have, especially quite important people or people of profession, would have a stamp that would have like a sign or an insignia on them. They'd press that into the wax, and then that would seal up the envelope, which meant that it would be noticed if the seal had been undone. So he opens the seal, the envelope that contains these documents from Lanyon. Within, there was another enclosure, likewise sealed, and marked upon the cover as not to be opened till the death or disappearance of Henry Jekyll. So inside the envelope, then, there is yet another sealed envelope that can't be opened until Dr. Henry Jekyll has also died. Now, Henry Jekyll is still alive at this point, which means that Utterson can't open this enclosure, this other envelope. Utterson could not trust his eyes. Yes, it was disappearance. Here again, as in the mad will, which he had long ago restored to its author, here again were the idea of a disappearance and the name of Henry Jekyll bracketed. So he's remarking here that this is the second thing that he's had in his possession that has said can only be opened on the disappearance of Henry Jekyll. Now, if it were to be opened on the death of Henry Jekyll, that would be one thing, but the fact that both of them talk about the disappearance of Henry Jekyll is quite an unusual thing for somebody just of his stature for it to be assumed that he's going to disappear in some way. But in the will, that idea had sprung from the sinister suggestion of the man Hyde. It was set there with a purpose all too plain and horrible. Written by the hand of Lanyon, what should it mean? A great curiosity came to the trustee. The trustee means the person that's in possession of it. So in this case, it's Utterson. To disregard the prohibition and to dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries. For professional honour and faith to his dead friend were stringent obligations, and the packet slept in the innermost corner of his private safe. So the part there where it says that Utterson had this urge to disregard the prohibition. Prohibition means to be stopped from doing something, and so he has this sudden urge to ignore the banning of the front of the envelope that says that it's not to be opened until the disappearance of Henry Jekyll, and he thinks that he wants to dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries. So he has this sudden urge to ignore the trust that's been put in him and to open the envelope. But then it says professional honour and faith to his dead friend were stringent obligations. Stringent means quite powerful. So in other words, the trust that people have put in override this sudden urge that he has. And then it says the packet, so the envelope was put into the innermost corner of his safe. So even though he's got this urge to suddenly open it up and see what's inside, he doesn't. He's true to his word and to his profession and to his promise to his friend, and he puts the envelope from Dr. Lanyon back into his safe unopened. It's one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it, and it may be doubted if, from that day forth, Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. So it's suggesting here that Utterson, even though he didn't look at the envelope, he's still very curious. And as it says here, that it says that it may be doubted if Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. The surviving friend, of course, is Jekyll, so he's suggesting that Utterson perhaps doesn't have a desire to be around Jekyll quite as much anymore. So he's distancing himself from Jekyll following the death of Lanyon because he doesn't know what's gone on. He thought of him kindly, but his thoughts were disquieted and fearful. He went to call, indeed, but he was perhaps relieved to be denied admittance. Perhaps in his heart he preferred to speak with Poole upon the doorstep, and surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city, rather than to be admitted into that house of voluntary bondage and to sit and speak with its inscrutable recluse. So it suggests that Utterson doesn't utterly abandon Jekyll. He does keep going to call on him, but he's constantly denied admittance, so he's not allowed to go in. And he says that he's perhaps relieved to speak on the doorstep with Poole rather than to actually go into the house. And he describes Dr. Jekyll here as an inscrutable recluse. If you're inscrutable, it suggests that you are perhaps lacking in morals in some way. And obviously recluse means that he's a hermit in the house. He's refusing to leave the house. So Utterson is true to his word, true to what we learned about it at the opening of chapter 1, where he said he was often the last friend that people had when their lives went off the rails. So he's trying very hard still with Jekyll, but he's perhaps relieved when Jekyll isn't there for him to speak to. Poole had indeed no very pleasant news to communicate. The doctor, it appeared, now more than ever confined himself to the cabinet over the laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was out of spirits. He'd grown very silent. He did not read. It seemed as if he had something on his mind. Utterson became so used to the unvarying character of these reports that he fell off little by little in the frequency of his visits. So Poole tells him here then that it's the same every time he goes round, that Poole sort of says that Dr. Jekyll confines himself to the laboratory at the end of his garden, to the cabinet, and he sometimes even sleeps there. That he was out of spirits, so there's obviously something troubling him. He's become very silent. He didn't read anymore, and he seemed to have something very, very heavy weighing on his mind. And at the end of the chapter there, it says that Utterson's visits fell off little by little in frequency. In other words, he starts to distance himself a little more here. So it seems that Dr. Jekyll, he's becoming more and more without friends. I mean, he has nobody now. And we discovered a bit later on that the reason why he stays in the cabinet is because the transformations into Edward Hyde start to become out of his control. So actually he has to kind of keep himself away because of what he's done, and not just the murder of Danvers Carew, but of course now he also has the death of Lanyon on his mind.